People talk about Gazans returning home, but what are they returning to?
Well, as I think your viewers will have seen over the last few months, the level of destruction in the Gaza Strip is without precedent. We in the United Nations Development Programme and the Regional Economic Commission put an estimate of 60 plus years of development lost, 67% of the infrastructure either damaged or destroyed. Not just shelter, but also the infrastructure that provides water, the infrastructure that deals with sewage. The whole public and solid waste management system collapsed. We are dealing literally with a situation where most Gazans will return to either a heavily damaged building they cannot move back into, or simply a pile of rubble. On top of that, an enormous challenge right now is that across Gaza we estimate 42 million tons of rubble that will now have to be moved. But that rubble is still dangerous. Not only are there potentially bodies that have never been evacuated from there, there are also unexploded ordnance, landmines. It's a highly toxic environment in which the ability to even begin to clear up and to get back to the places that people called home is extremely difficult right now.
So what needs to be done now?
Well, I think what you have seen in the last 48 hours since the ceasefire began is, first of all, what the Secretary General of the United Nations and many have called for time and again over the last 50 months. Open access, allow humanitarian aid to come in. We saw over 600 trucks on Sunday. We saw over 900 trucks coming in on Monday. We have not really received reports of looting. The ability to bring in aid, food, medicines, the basic things to survive are the top priority right now, and that is what the international community is providing. At the same time, we also need to think about early recovery, and this is where the United Nations Development Programme, with its program of assistance to the Palestinian people, the UN team and sister agencies have worked with the international community, the Palestinian Authority, to also develop a rapid response capacity on early recovery. Not only the removal of rubble, for instance, bringing in solar-powered water treatment plants so people have clean drinking water, beginning to create the conditions where people can start to reconstruct the public and social infrastructure, employment opportunities to the people of Gaza who essentially have lingered now for over a year in survival mode.
But we are still in the first stage of the ceasefire. What does it mean for what you can provide at the moment?
Well, as I mentioned, we work as part of the UN family. So just in the last few days, the United Nations system, together with international NGOs, has been providing enormous amounts of support, humanitarian support, food, medicines, additional shelter, materials. But we, for example, as UNDP, have also had our staff essentially trapped inside Gaza for the last 15 months. And during this period, we have tried to provide support to local communities. In one area that UNDP was asked in particular to focus on was the removal of solid waste. It's a public health hazard, and we estimate roughly 220,000 tons of public waste were removed in recent months in order to create conditions where people could at least not have to walk around in human feces and essentially broken sewage systems.
So what are the next stages? What do you envision?
I think, like many observers right now, there is still a great deal of nervousness. Will the ceasefire hold? Will the steps 2 and 3 really evolve? I think the purely human reflex is so powerful. You saw the thousands of people immediately moving back towards the areas that they used to call their homes, where they have not been able to return to. There is an enormous yearning for the guns to have stopped, the killing to have stopped, and for people being able to resume even the beginnings of reconstructing their lives. For us as the international community, it's a very crucial moment, first of all, to ensure that the next steps in the ceasefire agreement and the release of hostages, but also of prisoners, actually proceeds. That will open the door for a very significant effort that has been prepared and in many ways is ready to roll out in early recovery work. I mentioned some examples already earlier on: basic infrastructure, helping people to rebuild shelter, creating the public and social infrastructure for people to even be able to interact with authorities in Gaza when it comes to social safety nets, registering people. And then also looking at employment opportunities, livelihoods, whether it's micro, small enterprises that we are able to support, or whether it is also essentially employing thousands of people in rubble removal, reconstruction. All of these are opportunities to begin to lay down a path where people can see a future for them to recover.
Does it mean rebuilding a whole society, more or less, in Gaza?
Well, I think if you look at the trauma that people have lived through, it's not only the physical infrastructure that has obviously suffered enormous damage. People have lost tens of thousands of relatives, brothers, sisters, children, parents, grandparents. There's a level of trauma that we also know from past instances like this that will obviously affect people for years to come. Providing psychosocial support, being able to also help people find each other again. Remember, many children may be orphans right now. They maybe have been taken care of by strangers who took them into their tent. There is a lot of work that also our sister agencies will have to do, and then even beginning to re-establish, for instance, the education and healthcare system and infrastructure. Essentially, no child has really gone to school in Gaza for 15 months. If we don't act very rapidly, we may have a generation of at least 3 or 4 school years never returning to school again. Their entire lives will take a different direction as a result. So this is the spectrum of activities that, first of all, Gazans themselves are looking at right now, and we as an international community, including in the United Nations family, are very focused on.
Do you have sufficient resources to do that, what you just described?
I think for the initial humanitarian support right now, there have been significant pledges. But as you saw, when you start moving 600, 800, 1,000 trucks per day into Gaza, no, we will, through the various channels, need more resources, no question about it. But that's for the humanitarian immediate support and aid. It's life-saving, so to speak. The billions of dollars that will need to be mobilized for even early recovery work, and then in the longer term reconstruction, will be in the tens of billions. And it is indeed an enormous challenge to be able to mobilize these resources. The international community will obviously be called upon to step forward. The private sector can also invest, so to speak, in that recovery and reconstruction work. But it is an enormous uphill struggle to mobilize the resources for this huge early recovery and reconstruction work over the next years.
So do you see countries being ready to mobilize these kind of resources, billions and billions of dollars for rebuilding Gaza?
I think many would, first of all, in view of the fact that this conflict has not only created enormous suffering and trauma in the region, but has affected countries and politics and communities across the world. I think many countries are ready to step up in order to diffuse, first of all, and de-risk the likelihood that, fighting resumes, bombardments resume. That inevitably involves stepping up and helping to also invest in the reconstruction and the rehabilitation of infrastructure in Gaza. I would not go so far as saying countries are simply ready to step up and finance that scale of investment, but I think for the initial programs, the signals are relatively positive that countries are ready to step up. And we've heard many of them also make public statements to that end.
What about the neighboring countries like Lebanon? What can they do or should do?
Well, I think if you look to Lebanon right now, Lebanon is preoccupied with its own recovery and early recovery and reconstruction process. It has now a new government, so there is a perspective that Lebanon itself, which has been in a perennial economic crisis and governance crisis, can now focus on a way forward. And obviously, I think there is a lot of expectation that also with developments in Syria, the enormous burden that Lebanese people and Lebanon carried in hosting Syrian refugees may now actually become less of a challenge, because many Syrians, if indeed developments in Syria hold, will likely return to their home country. So there is an extraordinary amount of movement and change happening in the region. I think we should not be presumptuous on any front. All of these processes are vulnerable and volatile. They need a lot of support, and particularly from the perspective of the United Nations and the international community, a proactive approach to supporting the positive developments that have happened, and in particular to view these as a unique opportunity.
Where do you see Europe in this process? Does Europe have an important role?
Oh, I think, first of all, factually speaking, Europe is a very key partner to many countries in the region. It was heavily engaged not only in the traumatic conflict that happened over the last 15 months with the occupied Palestinian territories. It is also a partner that has financed with billions of euros the refugee response plans in neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. It is a potential partner also for recovery and reconstruction. Let us remember, more than 90% of Syria's population today lives below the poverty line. And the amount of economic reconstruction and rebuilding of economies and livelihoods is equally enormous in the region as such. But let us be very clear. If people have hope, if they have perspective, if they can start rebuilding their lives, this is probably the best return on investment in terms of stabilizing a region and ultimately enabling people to move away from the specter of conflict, division, and very polarized politics.
Where do you see Israel's role in the whole process? What do you expect?
I think Israel, as in any conflict, has to be a good faith negotiating partner. I think the developments that will unfold over the coming weeks, first of all, with respect to the ceasefire in Gaza, but also to finding a way forward in terms of the two-state solution pathway. All of this will no doubt play out. And, as we know, there are domestic politics and there are international politics. I think the best hope the region has is that everybody recognizes that there must be a way forward that takes us beyond of where we have been essentially paralyzed for the past 10 years or some would say decades.
Thank you very much, Achhim Steiner, for the interview.
Thank you.